Picture a pilot in the cockpit of a big bomber. Instruments in front of him, clouds below, everything routine. Except for one thing. A few feet behind his back, shielded from him by nothing but a thick slab of lead, a nuclear reactor is running at full power. The real thing, a live core, uranium inside, radiation pouring off it that you can't see, can't smell, can't hear. It just runs, while the man flies the plane. And add one more detail. Alongside that plane, on every single flight, flew a second aircraft. Inside it sat armed Marines with parachutes. Their job was simple and grim. If the plane with the reactor went down, they would jump after it, cordon off the crash site, and let no one near. Not to rescue, to guard. That's the thought the pilot carried aloft. Behind me is something they'll only let our own people approach, behind a cordon. That's where we start today. Not with a blueprint, with a very simple human feeling that never made it into any flight log. This is the story of the atomic airplane, a dream both superpowers caught at the same time in the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union both. The idea was bold to the point of arrogance. An ordinary aircraft is chained to the ground by its fuel. The kerosene runs out, you land. But what if the fuel never runs out? What if there's a reactor in the belly of the machine and a single load of uranium keeps it aloft, not for hours, but for weeks? Such a plane could loiter off an enemy's border as long as it liked, waiting for the order, never coming home for another tank of gas. In the early 50s, that didn't sound like science fiction. It sounded like a military necessity. The intercontinental missile didn't exist yet, and an ordinary bomber simply couldn't reach a target on the far side of the planet without refueling. Whoever put the first endless airplane into the sky would own the world. And here's the astonishing part. They went after it for real, not on paper. Both countries actually got a reactor into the air. The Americans had a rebuilt giant with 10 engines that flew 47 times over the deserts with a live, running reactor aboard. The Soviets had a converted strategic bomber, 34 flights in a single summer. Two countries, two engineering worlds, the same insane assignment. But before we get to how they did it, an honest thing the splashy headlines tend to swallow. Neither plane flew on nuclear power. The reactor ran, but the propellers were turned by ordinary engines. They were, in plain terms, flying test stands, enormous flying questions. And both asked the same one, eerily identical. Can you even put a working reactor inside an airplane without killing the crew? Because the physics here is merciless. To make thrust, the reactor must be powerful. The more powerful, the deadlier its radiation. To shield a human from it, you need mass. Lead, water, heavy screens. The better the shielding, the heavier it gets. The heavier the plane, the more powerful a reactor it needs just to leave the ground. A snake eating its own tail. Every step towards saving the pilot made the machine heavier, and therefore more dangerous. So here's the question this whole thing is built around. If both superpowers poured billions into the idea, if a reactor really flew over Texas and over the outskirts of Moscow alike, why isn't there a single atomic airplane today? Why was the dream shut down quietly on both sides? I'll give you my answer at the end. but I'd rather you got there yourself. And we have to begin not with an airplane, but with fear. Because this race didn't accelerate from blueprints. It accelerated from terror of what the other side supposedly already had flying. And one faked photograph in an American magazine scared a whole country worse than any real machine ever could. On December 1st, 1958, the American magazine Aviation Week, a serious publication read in design bureaus and at the Pentagon alike, ran a scorching article. The headline: Soviets flight testing nuclear bomber. The text said it in black and white. The Russians had pulled far ahead of America. They already had a plane with a nuclear power plant flying, capable of circling the globe without landing. Photographs of an unfamiliar machine ran with it. The effect was like a punch to the gut. Newspapers picked it up. The story rolled across the country, and fear rolled with it. Just a year earlier, the Soviet Union had launched the first satellite, and America was already living with the humiliating sense of falling behind in space. Now it seemed it was falling behind in the sky, too. That somewhere over the taiga, an atomic bomber was already flying laps. One nobody could reach, and nobody could match. There was just one catch. None of it existed. The plane in the photographs was real, but not atomic. It was a Miyasachev machine, an experimental jet bomber, the M50, conventional, running on kerosene. A long-range combat aircraft that, as it happens, never even entered service. No reactor, no endless flight. The magazine had taken, or been skillfully nudged into taking, an ordinary plane for a nuclear miracle. And here's where it gets interesting. Historians who dug into this noticed something odd. The details in the article matched classified intelligence reports suspiciously well, including the code name those reports had assigned to the supposed Soviet atomic plane. Where does a civilian magazine get classified data? The uncomfortable conclusion suggests itself. The leak wasn't an accident. Someone inside the system wanted America scared. Because a frightened country doesn't count its money. And American atomic aviation, at that very moment, was having a hard time with funding. Sit with that mechanism. To pry loose money for your project, you have to convince everyone the enemy is already ahead. It doesn't matter whether it's true. What matters is that people believe it. And the country believed in a plane that didn't exist and poured billions into chasing a ghost. An arms race is often driven not by a real threat, but by its plausible shadow. Now let's go back a decade to understand the ground this panic fell on. The idea of an atomic airplane was born in America not in '58, but back in 1946, right after the war, when the atom seemed the key to everything. Why spend uranium only on a bomb, the military reasoned, when it could drive airplanes too? An enormous program rose up. The best firms, the best physicists. And the platform for the reactor was already there. A giant bomber with 10 engines, 6 turning propellers, and 4 jets. A machine so large you could hide anything inside it. Reactor and tons of shielding alike. On the Soviet side ran a mirror image effort. The same logic, the same drive, the same closed research centers where physicists and aircraft designers wrestled with one problem. Only without the loud magazine hoaxes. There, everything was sealed tight under secrecy. So by the late 50s, both countries weren't merely dreaming. Both were already building, and both spurred themselves with the fear that the other would get there first. The race was real, only the trigger was fake. But how was this perpetual engine even supposed to work? How do you make a lump of uranium haul a multi-ton machine across the sky? It turned out to be surprisingly simple. And in that very simplicity hid the poison. Take an ordinary jet engine. Up front, a compressor sucks in air and squeezes it. That compressed air goes into a combustion chamber, where kerosene is sprayed in and lit. Hot gas blasts out the nozzle, and the plane flies. The whole thing runs on fire. Now take the fire away. Take out the kerosene, take out the combustion chamber, and in their place put a reactor core. The air is still squeezed by the compressor, but now it's heated not by a flame, but by nuclear heat. White hot, it blasts out the nozzle exactly the same way and shoves the machine forward exactly the same way. Same engine. Its heart is just nuclear now instead of chemical. And in that swap lies all the appeal and all the horror of the idea. A pound of uranium holds more energy than millions of pounds of kerosene ever could. The reactor needs no air to burn, no tanks, no refueling every few hours. Load the uranium once and heat air for weeks. A plane that no longer needs the ground. That's what hovered before designers on both sides of the ocean. The Americans went at it big. They already had that giant, a bomber with 6 piston engines on pusher propellers and 4 jets besides. They turned it into a flying laboratory. The reactor, air-cooled, about 1 megawatt, weighing over 15 tons, was hung on a hook in the middle bomb bay. The clever part, it came out. After every flight, it was pulled and lowered underground into a special vault so it wouldn't irradiate the equipment and people back at the field. A plane that said goodbye to its own heart every evening. Between 1955 and 1957, that machine made 47 flights, more than 200 hours aloft, with the reactor running for nearly 90 of them over the deserts of New Mexico and Texas. The Soviet engineers took the same road with their own machine, a strategic turboprop giant the West knew as the Bear. Into its fuselage they set a smaller reactor, water-cooled and water-moderated, about 100 kilowatts of thermal power. In the summer of '61, over a little more than 3 months, that flying laboratory went up 34 times. And here's that honest detail again, without which the whole story turns into a fairy tale. Neither the megawatt American reactor nor the 100 kilowatt Soviet one gave 1 ounce of thrust in flight. They simply ran. Both nations' machines flew on conventional engines. These were scouts into the future, sent to find out whether a human could survive next to a reactor in the air, before anyone dared build a real atomic engine. The real engine existed only on paper. In the Soviet Union, it lived as a design in which 2 of the 4 engines would become atomic, drawing heat from an onboard reactor, while the outer 2 stayed ordinary turboprops, so the thing could take off and land like a civilized aircraft. A flyable machine was never built. The Americans had their own never-born atomic plane, the very reason the flying laboratory was flogged through the sky. Notice this. Both sides intuitively found the same answer. Reactor in the tail, far from the people. Make only some of the engines atomic, not all, so takeoff and landing don't depend on a temperamental nuclear plant. Different countries, different schools, and identical conclusions. That's what happens when a problem is dictated not by ideology, but by physics. Physics is the same for everyone. And yet the central question of these machines was never thrust or range. All 47 American flights and 34 Soviet ones turned around one thing: the human being. How to seat a living pilot a few feet from a running reactor and bring him back to the ground alive. And it's that solution, the most terrifying and the most ingenious in the whole story, we're about to walk into. The lead coffin the engineers built around the crew. For the Americans, it wasn't a cockpit in any ordinary sense. It was a capsule. When the bomber was turned into a flying laboratory, the entire nose section was cut away and rebuilt from scratch. A sealed cocoon of lead and rubber weighing close to 12 tons. 12 tons of shielding for the sole purpose of covering 5 men. A pilot, a co-pilot, a flight engineer, and 2 nuclear engineers. And so they could see anything at all, that cocoon got a windshield of leaded glass about a foot thick. 12 inches, the width of a man's hand turned on edge. The pilots looked at the world through that slab, and it still wasn't enough. Between the reactor in the tail and the capsule in the nose, they set one more barrier, a disc of lead weighing around 4 tons, a separate wall across the fuselage. A nesting doll of protection, a heavy cocoon around the men, a heavy disc in the path of the radiation, and dozens of feet of empty fuselage between. A curious detail. Inside that capsule, it was unnaturally quiet. The crew reported that the roar of all 10 engines on takeoff was barely audible. Lead and rubber muffled not just radiation, but sound. A man sat as if inside a bank vault someone had lifted into the sky. And just beyond its thin walls ran the very thing the vault was built for. Why the extremes? Why not simply wrap the reactor on every side? Here's the heart of the engineering nightmare. You cannot armor a core on all sides. The weight alone would keep the plane on the ground. So you don't shield the reactor, you shield the human. And not from every direction, only from the side where the crew sits. It's called shadow shielding. You put the heavy screen between the reactor and the cabin, like an umbrella against rain that falls from one direction only. After that, distance does the work. The longer the fuselage, the farther the men from the core, the weaker the radiation reaching them. Hence these enormous machines with the reactor in the tail and the capsule in the very nose. The length wasn't luxury, but length was armor. The Soviet engineers solved the same problem with their own recipe. Between the nose cabin and the middle of the fuselage, they built a partition. Lead plates about 2 inches thick, and behind them a layer of polyethylene and a special compound, Saracen, with boron carbide added, roughly 8 inches deep. There's subtle physics in that. A reactor throws 2 kinds of radiation at once. Heavy lead does a fine job stopping gamma rays, but neutrons pass through lead almost untouched. Those are halted by light, hydrogen-rich materials, that same polyethylene. So the shield was layered, a separate layer for each threat. Tests showed it worked reliably enough. A genuine engineering victory, even over a problem that perhaps shouldn't have been set. Now put yourself in the seat of the man inside. Outside, an ordinary flight. Inside, knowledge. That a few feet behind a sealed wall, a chain reaction is running, that uranium is splitting right now while your hands are on the yoke. The reactor doesn't growl, doesn't shake, gives nothing away. If you could look inside a working core underwater, in research reactors you can see it, it glows a steady blue, a ghostly light thrown off by particles traveling through water faster than light moves in that water. Beautiful and terrible. Only the pilots never saw that glow. Tons of lead stood between them and the core. They simply knew it was there, and they flew. The engineers did the nearly impossible. They built a wall around a man that held death at arm's length. They beat the radiation for the few hours a flight lasted. But who were these people in the cockpit, under the lead? Who agreed to climb into a lead coffin and go up with a reactor at their back, again and again? And above all, why did these flights even matter if not one of them moved the atomic engine an inch closer? These flights had a secret, almost mundane purpose. And that's the next conversation. Start with the purpose, because it explains everything else. These flights weren't a test of the atomic engine. There was no engine yet. They were a test of the shielding. The central question ran like this: how much radiation actually reaches the crew and the instruments, and does that capsule of lead and polyethylene hold it back? To find out, the reactor had to be put into the air and the dose honestly measured. So radiation monitoring instruments rode aboard, and the flight itself became one long, painstaking exercise in dosimetry. No wonder these missions were later called secret flights for a dose. Secret, because everything was classified, down to the last figure. And it wasn't faceless Soviet pilots at the controls, but specific people. The lead test pilot of the Flying Atomic Laboratory was Nuptikov. Going up with him were Goryunov, Zhila, and others. The lead engineer on the machine was Lashkevich. In flight, the reactor was watched by its operator, Smolsky, and the radiation level monitored by the physicist Razumovsky. Remember those names, because these were the men who climbed into that plane time after time, knowing full well that an open core was running behind their backs. Not out of recklessness, as a job. And before the reactor was ever sent into the sky, it was broken in slowly and carefully on the ground. In 1958, a ground test stand was built and moved to a proving range near Semipalatinsk. In the first half of 1959, the reactor was first started there on the ground. Brought up to rated power, instruments and radiation controls and shielding all checked out. Only once they were sure the shielding held did they dare lift the installation into the air. Despite the cliché, there was no recklessness here. There was methodical, engineer's-grade thoroughness. And behind it all stood real names at the very top, too. The reactor side of the aviation program was led at the Kurchatov Institute by academician Alexandrov. The whole atomic project answered to Kurchatov himself. The airframe and reactor installation were built by Tupolov's design bureau in a branch under the engineer Nezval. Physicists and aircraft men told to do what no one had done before. And they did it. It's worth being honest about the cost of this work, too. A reactor on board is no passenger. Even behind the best shielding, a background remains, a dose that accumulates. The people who flew and worked beside a live core for years, in the air and on ground stands alike, paid for it with their health. and many knew what they were getting into. In declassified memoirs, it comes through without pathos. There was a task. There was an order. There was the professional pride of doing the impossible. The dose was something you tried not to say out loud. And here, it's important to resist a temptation. It's easy to turn these people into poster heroes, or, the other way, into victims of a mad system. Neither would be the truth. They were professionals doing dangerous work at the frontier of technology, exactly like their counterparts across the ocean, climbing into a lead capsule over Texas. The respect here is owed to the people and the engineering, but the task itself, for which they were irradiated over and over, was demanding louder every year to be asked, was it even worth it? Because shielding the human was only half the job. The other half hid inside the engine. It's one thing to wall a crew off from a reactor that merely hangs on a hook. It's another to make that reactor produce thrust. And there, in the engines, the real technical hell began. We remember the principle of the atomic engine. Air is squeezed by the compressor, heated by the reactor, blasted out the nozzle. Simple in words. The devil hid in exactly how the heat from the uranium got into the air. And here the designers split onto two roads. The fork wasn't between nations, it was between two ways of thinking. And both roads led into their own circle of hell. The first road, the direct cycle, the boldest, the most head-on. The air from the compressor is sent straight through the reactor core. It passes through the white-hot uranium, takes its heat, and goes right out the nozzle. In America, this was General Electric's work, tested on a whole series of ground reactors. The direct cycle gave monstrous thrust. The air heated directly off the hottest thing in the machine. But that simplicity had a black underside. Air that has passed through the core comes out already contaminated. The plane left an invisible radioactive trail. It poisoned the very sky it flew through and the ground beneath. An engine that fouls the place it breathes. The second road, the closed, indirect cycle. Here you put a middleman between reactor and air. The heat is first picked up by a separate coolant pumped through pipes, and that coolant hands it to the air through a heat exchanger. The air never meets the uranium. The exhaust comes out clean. In America, this path was Pratt & Whitney's. And here's an immediate correction to the popular tale that the Americans built the dirty engine and the Soviets the clean one. Not true. Both countries wrestled with both cycles at once. A shared engineering fork, not a contest of nations. The Soviet atomic engine carried the designation NK-14A, and historians of technology still argue over it. Some sources call it a direct cycle. Others say closed, with heat exchangers fed by a separate coolant. The very fact that decades on, no one quite agrees which cycle it used is the best testimony to how raw and how secret the technology was. But one detail is known for certain, and it speaks for itself. That engine was supposed to run on ordinary kerosene during takeoff and landing, and switch to nuclear heat only once airborne, so it wouldn't contaminate the airfield and the people on the ground. The design itself admitted it. This is a thing best not switched on while you're standing next to it. And the closed, clean cycle had its own Achilles heel, every bit as hellish. Its coolant was liquid metal, sodium or lithium, say, or water under crushing pressure. Liquid metal carries heat beautifully, better than any water. But it has a vicious habit. Let it cool even a little, and it freezes solid. A plug right there in the pipes. And any sharp swing in temperature threatens to burst those pipes open. Picture a system you can neither overheat nor let cool, held forever in a narrow temperature window, or it ruptures or turns to stone. And all of it in a shaking aircraft next to a reactor. Cleanliness came dear. The engine became a structure on the edge of tearing itself apart. So both roads were cursed, each in its own way. Take the direct cycle and you get thrust and a radioactive plume off the tail. Take the closed cycle and you get clean exhaust and a hellish web of pipes full of liquid metal, ready to kill you at the first hiccup. The designer wasn't choosing between good and bad. He was choosing the particular way in which his machine would be dangerous. And the bitterest part? Even if the engineers had perfected either engine, one question remained that crossed out everything. Not thrust, not clean exhaust. What happens when a machine like this one day falls? Because machines fall. All of them. And the most alarming thing, a reactor for an atomic engine had already once slipped out of control and melted on the ground for now. On November 18, 1958, at a test range in Idaho, on a ground reactor where the Americans were developing the direct cycle, the thing everyone feared happened. The reactor ran away. The automatic system, instead of shutting the installation down, mistakenly withdrew the control rods because of a false signal about the power level, a fault in the power supply to a sensor. The emergency safety that should have stopped everything didn't. It, too, had been installed with an error. The power surged, the fuel melted. A reactor for an atomic aircraft engine turned into a molten mass. And that was on the ground, under full control, on a stand bristling with instruments, surrounded by the best specialists. Not in a shaking aircraft, not in a storm, not in combat, in the hothouse conditions of a test range. And it melted anyway. Now move that installation, in your mind, onto a machine that takes off, lands, hits turbulence, and one day inevitably crashes. Up to now, we've admired the nerve of the idea and the tons of lead. Time to settle the bill. Start with the simplest part. The radioactive trail off the tail. A direct cycle plane poisoning the sky it flies through. And that's not somewhere over enemy territory. Before it ever reaches the enemy, it has to take off at home, warm up at home, circle on exercises at home. And it leaves that whole trail over its own land, its own cities, the very people it's meant to protect. A weapon that starts killing its own side before it ever reaches the other. And here is what the whole enterprise broke against. A machine like this cannot be properly tested. An ordinary plane is run for thousands of hours. You break it, fix it, refine it. But how do you run a reactor that contaminates everything beneath it? Every full power test flight is a strip of contamination drawn across half a country. The closed cycle was no rescue. Its pipes of liquid metal, ready to burst, meant one serious accident scatters the reactor across the countryside, just as in Idaho, only no longer on a test range. And here comes the cold thought there's no escaping. What happens when an atomic plane crashes? Not if, when, because they all crash eventually. An ordinary bomber, going down, kills its crew and whoever is unlucky below. An atomic one scatters a reactor that was running. It contaminates fields, water, a city, for years. And here's the paradox that doomed the whole design. A machine like this, falling on its own territory, would strike its own country harder than it ever could strike the enemy. It was built so people could sleep easier, and it turned out the greatest threat to the homeland stood in the homeland's own hangar. Notice this is no longer a question of thrust, weight, or cycle. It's a question of the essence. Can you even put a working reactor into the sky and not poison the very people it's supposed to defend? All those years, all those tons of lead, all that glass a hand thick were an attempt to dodge one inconvenient fact. A reactor doesn't tell friend from foe. Radiation strikes in every direction equally, and no matter how much shielding you build around it, at the core remains a thing that can never be fully tamed. The engineers felt it. The military? Not yet. They still saw the eternal bomber off an enemy's border. And it was precisely at this moment, when common sense had begun to speak up, that the obsession took a step that looks today like something close to madness. Someone decided, let's remove the weakest, most expensive link to shield. Let's remove the human. And since the radioactive exhaust poisons everything below it anyway, let that not be a side effect. Let it become the weapon. It sounds insane. But a machine like that really was begun. The machine with no human got a name, Project Pluto, and it was conceived not as an airplane, but as a cruise missile. Here's its portrait, and brace yourself. A supersonic missile flying on the deck, speed past Mach 3, altitude around 1,000 feet off the ground. Inside, a nuclear ramjet, the one with air running straight through the reactor. On board, between 14 and 26 thermonuclear warheads, which it would drop one after another as it tore over its targets. And its own exhaust, scorching, radioactive, wasn't an unfortunate byproduct, but part of the plan. Everything it passed over at low level it would poison by the simple fact of its flight. Shockwave, thunder, radiation, and warheads on top. A weapon with no innocent side. The project was directed by the physicist Ted Merkel at Lawrence Livermore. And here's a telling detail of how the engineers themselves saw their creation. For its brute simplicity and indestructibility, they nicknamed the missile the Flying Crowbar. No delicate electronics, no fragile parts, a slab of metal with a reactor that just flies and sows death. In the nickname, you can hear grim engineering respect mixed with horror. And the crucial thing, this didn't stay on paper. The reactors for Pluto were built and fired. The first run came in '61. And on May 20th, 1964, the second, perfected reactor ran at full power for about 5 minutes. Roughly 500 megawatts. Consider that. The reactor carried on the American Flying Laboratory was about 1 megawatt. This was nearly 500 times more, with thrust equivalent to 35,000 pounds. It worked. Now, what the thing was made of, because the details won't let go. The core, about 500,000 pencil-shaped ceramic fuel elements, made by a porcelain company that normally made dishware. The air in the core was heated to around 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The hottest parts were made of a heat-resistant alloy, the same one used on the capsule of the Mercury spacecraft. 500,000 porcelain pencils, white hot, with air screaming past them at supersonic speed. No one had built anything like it, before or since. Pluto was tested in the Nevada desert, at a site with a telling name, Jackass Flats. And the scale of the preparation is itself a portrait of the era. To simulate the oncoming airflow, air was compressed and stored in 25 miles of steel oil well pipe. 25 miles of pipe just to blow on the reactor for 5 minutes. And after a run, the scorching radioactive installation had to be hauled off for disassembly. You couldn't approach it, so they built a special, fully automated railroad. The reactor rolled itself away a couple of miles into a sealed building where it was taken apart by remote control, by manipulator arms. There was no place for a human there. Stop for a second and weigh where the thinking had gone. It began with a dream of an eternal bomber that would spare a pilot from refueling. It arrived at a machine you can't approach, that poisons everything below it by design, and whose test reactor is wheeled away from people on a robotic railroad. The logic of, let's build a weapon that can't be stopped, drove itself to absurdity. It produced a weapon that can't even be properly tested. And that Pluto really worked, became its death sentence. Because the closer it came to ready, the louder the question grew, the one nobody could answer. How, exactly, do you flight test it without turning a piece of your own country into a radioactive strip? It was time to draw a line under this whole story, honestly, with the numbers in hand. Let's settle the account. No grand words, the numbers in hand. The United States poured 15 years into atomic aviation, from 1946, and, by the most conservative count, around $1 billion. It put a reactor of about 1 megawatt into the sky, made 47 flights, more than 200 hours aloft. Project Pluto ran separately from that. Another 7.5 years and about $260 million. And yes, its reactor really delivered its 500 megawatts. The Soviet Union lifted its own reactor, smaller, about 100 kilowatts, and made 34 flights in a single summer, 1961. The best physicists of two superpowers, tons of lead, years of labor, a melted reactor in Idaho, secret flights for a dose near Semipalatinsk. And now, the number usually hidden behind the loud word atomic plane. 0. That's exactly how many feet any aircraft flew on nuclear power. Not one. Not the American, not the Soviet. Both flying laboratories ran the whole way on ordinary engines, while the reactor aboard simply ran, like a passenger under study. They were flying test stands, enormous flying questions. A true atomic airplane, held up by the force of splitting uranium, never took off. The picture of an eternal bomber soaring for weeks on nuclear thrust stayed exactly that. A picture, the very one a magazine once printed with a faked photo. So what was this idea? A brilliant breakthrough ahead of its age? Or a dead end doomed from the start? The honest answer? Both at once. The engineers really did achieve the near impossible. They proved a man could be seated beside a running reactor for a few hours and brought back alive. The shielding they beat. They made a ramjet work that had seemed impossible. At the level of individual problems, these were brilliant, ahead of their time solutions. But what lay at the very core they could not beat? The contaminated exhaust. The reactor you cannot drop. The installation that melts even on a stand. The weapon that doesn't tell friend from foe. Not for lack of brains, because it is, in principle, unbeatable. A brilliant dead end. A road traveled magnificently, straight into a wall. You can build the world's best lock for a door that should never be set in this house at all. And notice, both countries reached this conclusion independently, not conspiring, not copying each other. Through their own accidents and their own dead ends, American and Soviet designers alike ran into the same wall. When two rivals taking different roads arrive at the same point, it usually means the point is not their mistake, but a property of the problem itself. And yet, it wasn't fear of contamination that closed this road. Not conscience, not ecology. The reason was far colder and more ordinary. By the early 60s, something had appeared that, almost overnight, made the whole dream of the eternal bomber simply unnecessary. And that's the last conversation. Along the way, we'll see whether this dream truly died or merely went quiet for half a century. What killed the dream and what remains? What killed the atomic airplane didn't glow blue and didn't weigh 12 tons. It was far simpler and far more effective. The missile. An ordinary intercontinental ballistic missile. While the physicists fought over how to shield a pilot from the reactor at his back, the engineers next door perfected an entirely different weapon. A missile needs no crew to protect. It needs no tons of lead, no long fuselage, no airfield, no weeks aloft. It stands in a silo, waits for the order, and reaches another continent in half an hour. The very task the eternal bomber was built around, to reach an enemy on the far side of the planet, was suddenly solved cheaply, reliably, and without a single gram of uranium in the sky over one's own cities. And right behind it came the nuclear submarine. Here was where a reactor truly belonged, deep underwater, far from people, wrapped in an ocean that is itself the finest shield. A submarine with missiles could hide in the depths for months, invulnerable and invisible, and surface to strike from anywhere. Everything the atomic plane promised, constant presence, readiness to answer at any moment, the submarine delivered better. And without the risk of one day dropping a reactor on your own city. That's the whole secret. Atomic aviation was shut down not because anyone got scared. In America, the program was ended by President Kennedy back in 1961, saying plainly that 15 years of work and around $1 billion had left the atomic plane as remote as at the start. In the Soviet Union, the work quietly faded by the mid-60s. Both superpowers, independently, reached the same sober conclusion. Not, this is too dangerous, rather, this is no longer needed. A weapon had appeared that did the same job better and didn't carry its own worst threat in its own belly. What remains of the dream? In the Idaho desert, on an open lot, 2 melted ground reactors from those very atomic engines still stand. They were never scrapped. They're still radioactive, and you can't go near them. But anyone can come and see. A monument to an era that you aren't allowed to approach. You couldn't ask for a better metaphor. And yet to say the idea died for good would be untrue. In our own day, Russia has unveiled a cruise missile, the Burevestnik, with a small reactor that heats the oncoming air and promises near unlimited range. It's a direct descendant of that flying crowbar from the 60s. The same physics, the same dream. And, by open accounts, the same rake underfoot. Testing goes very badly, successes are few, and a serious accident is linked to the program. The same unsolvable dilemma that killed the atomic airplane half a century ago hasn't gone anywhere. The reactor still doesn't tell friend from foe. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Let's return, at the last, to the man we began with. The pilot in the cockpit with a reactor running behind his back. The man the engineers packed in lead, hid behind glass a hand thick, and behind whom, on every flight, flew Marines with parachutes, ready to cordon off the site of his possible death. Well, he won. Not because the shielding turned out perfect, because the idea that put him there was, in the end, set aside. The sky stayed his sky. The reactor stayed on the ground, where it belongs. Sometimes, the smartest move progress can make is to stop in time. Two great powers, having spent billions and years, proved to each other and to themselves one simple thing: that because something can be built, it does not follow that it's worth lifting into the sky. And what do you think? Was this a dead-end branch, rightly cut off? Or a dream ahead of its time, still waiting for its hour? The Burevestnik hints the argument isn't closed yet. Tell me what your gut says. As for my answer, I showed it to you today, and I suspect you reached it on your own.